Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Abby Krause with Becker's Hospital Review. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. We are pleased to have Scott Becker, publisher of Becker's Healthcare, here to moderate today's Q&A session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we will be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenters. Wendy Alexander is the Vice President of Data Analytics and Client Services for VisitPay. Wendy is a proven executive and leader in consumer finance and in transforming industries and improving customer experience by leveraging data, analytics, and mass customization. Prior to joining VisitPay, Wendy served as an executive and credit officer at Capital One Financial, where she led the development and growth of several new business lines. After leaving Capital One, Wendy served as Managing Director of Client Experience Solutions at TD Ameritrade. David Kirshner serves as Executive Advisor at VisitPay and is responsible for the continual development of quantitative value drivers specific to the ROI potential of the self-pay revenue cycle. Prior to joining VisitPay, David served 3 decades in public accounting, hospital and physician financial management, and chief financial officer positions in academic medicine, including the University of Rochester Medical Center and Boston Children's Hospital. He is a CPA who trained at Ernst & Young. David also currently serves on the board of Noble and Greenup School in Dedham, Massachusetts. David, I will now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Abby, and welcome everyone. Great to be here with Wendy Alexander from VisitPay, and I think we're in for an exciting discussion about something that is really challenging, I think, for all of our health systems around the country, is the increased deductibles and co-insurance experiences of patients continues to grow. We wanted to turn to the next slide and just remind ourselves that while we're experts in third-party insurance and the payer as a primary payer, thinking about a patient or a consumer as a payer is not something we've had the same level of experience with. So one of the things we want to do is focus on how consumers think about their desire to pay, which oftentimes is not necessarily something they want to do, with our need to get them to pay their balance quickly. And as we think about that, we want to kind of reflect a little bit on setting the stage here as Wendy and I start to go down the path of most of our health system leadership teams that are really focused on attracting and retaining patients and really having those patients have the best possible clinical and financial experience in their systems. Those are things I think you would hear in almost every hallway, in hospitals across America, physician groups across America. So the topic we're about to launch into, I think, will hopefully hit a number of the areas that are of focus for you today. I'm going to turn this over to Wendy to start to kick off our approach to thinking about patient payment.
Excellent. Well, thank you, David. And I think we're trying to get a slide advanced here. One moment. Excellent. Well, again, thank you for that intro, and thank you everyone for joining us on this call today. I think this is a both challenging and exciting time in thinking about the patient as payer in healthcare. One of the things that we'll talk about today is how we've seen that evolve in other spaces. So in my own experience in consumer finance, you can think of that as an industry that went from being very product-centric and also kind of yes, no, should you get a mortgage or not, should you get a loan or not, to something that became incredibly personalized with lots of options, both in terms of what people were able to receive and what best suited their needs, And then also in the delivery of that. So for example, in the digital platform, there's a learning that portals and applications also are a key part of tailoring the experience and ultimately delivering what people wanted and needed to do beyond the product itself. So as we think about applying these learnings into consumer finance in that way, I think there's three capabilities that will suit providers really well going forward, right? And they build on each other and work well with each other. So the first capability really touches on understanding the customer, and I think that's something that providers do very, very well today. And at the same time, there's ways, especially when they're thinking about their customers and their financial situation and their patient financial health, also using data and analytics to be able to know and differentiate them. So that tees up the second part of this, which is being able to tailor products and experiences to consumers in ways that make sense to them, meet their needs, are easy to use, and kind of addresses their situation where they are. Lastly, you want to be able to deliver that experience. So not only have a way to offer different solutions, but to be able to deliver that, whether that's through a digital portal, whether that's through phone operations internally or with an early out shop, or through texts and emails and printed messages, whether that's digital or on paper. So, I would just say, finally, all of these things together, you can deliver not only a great experience, but a personalized experience that's differentiated for different consumers. So building on that, I would say, when we're talking about analytics and customization, the analytics are really only useful when you can, when they're fit for a purpose. Are we, next slide? And so that means, not only having a model or an analytic approach that differentiates consumers, but is also applicable to the unique needs of an individual health system, and its environment, and its operating environment, to the unique needs of their own patients, and to, frankly, their revenue cycle and how it's operationally organized across those various stages. Next slide. So as we think about the revenue cycle across the stages, that will, begin, we frequently talk about that at, pre-visit, through visit, through an account being worked in AR, and, through bad debt. How do we think about developing foundational understanding, consumer understanding, using things like demographic data and consumer attributes? And then how do we use that to personalize and differentiate the experience? And across the revenue cycle, that can mean many things. It can mean the payment options that are available to someone, whether, for example, prepayment is or isn't required, or in what shape or form, how much detail someone wants to have about their visits in an interactive environment, the various communications that you send, whether those are texts or emails or phone calls, in a finance plan situation, whether you offer them, whether you charge interest, work intensity tailored plans. And so all of those are a rich way to differentiate the experience. And what we'd like to talk about today is a sample of 5 concrete places where we've seen work with some of our clients and seen our clients and partners do some pretty effective things. So we're going to talk a little bit about propensity to pay, which is oft talked about and can mean lots of different things to different people. We'll talk about what we mean here and how it can be the engine for more targeted segmentation across the revenue cycle. And then we're going to talk a little bit about SCIM, or an active passive strategy, about segmentation in AR, consumer segmentation, kind of a fun concept that I think we see lots of places, and we can start to see in this space called nudging. I'll talk about that, and bad debt segmentation.
Great. So we're going to start with the first of the 5 case studies that we want to touch on, Wendy, and going to the next slide. This is a health system that is actually not so dissimilar from a health system that I was just recently the CFO of. It's about $4 billion in net patient service revenue. And like many of us, they use a scoring model already, and they have for the last several years. Propensity to pay is something people have heard about, but maybe you could tee up a little bit what it is that's different now, what's available now for a more sophisticated health system that wants to go to the next level to really understand the consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I think of propensity to pay, and when I think of that in the context of patient experience and patient financial health, I think of propensity to pay as an input to all of the other things that you do. So I think sometimes we think of propensity to pay as a score in and of itself that by itself drives a lot of activity. What I've seen work well, or what we've sometimes have endeavored to do, is have propensity to pay be just that. Have a really well-grounded assessment and quantifiable indicator of both the likelihood of payment, which then transforms into payment for a group of individuals. So what we're showing on this slide is a situation where we compared a propensity to pay model that was built that way, that was incorporated multiple data sources and used a methodology to be clearly being predictive of payment, and then compared that to an existing model that may have not been built in quite the same way. And so what you see here on this slide on the left is a model that with the teal columns on the left, more clearly differentiating actual liquidation rate. So if you look on the right side, on kind of the highest scoring on that particular propensity pay model, the actual liquidation rate that you see from those that group is higher than what the highest scoring things on an existing model would have been. Similarly, if you go all the way to the left and you go to the lowest categories, you have little or no payment or liquidation rate from customers where, in some on the incumbent model. So that in and of itself is just a tool. So the next steps are how do you use and implement that? And we'll talk about some example segmentations here in a moment. But on the right, you can see applying that also. It really means that you can better separate your population into people who are very likely to pay, people who are not likely to pay, and some folks in the middle. And within that middle, you can rank order and prioritize how you want to both work and how you want to communicate to those customers.
So Wendy, I understand from our preparation for the webinar today that a lot of other industries do this already. It's relatively new to healthcare, but as you look at the segments like 7, 8, and 9, can you talk a little bit about what we're finding as we start to segment the patient population for a health system?
Yeah, great question. And I think what we find is that you certainly, for many health systems, will find and be able to differentiate a population of people that are going to be able to pay their bill, and they're willing and able to pay their bill. And there certainly is a population of folks that don't have ability to pay their bill. And the way you treat those patients and customers is perhaps like it's been in the past, where you just want to make a simple, positive, happy experience for the payers, make it easy for them to do business, don't confuse them, and have them walk away feeling as good about the financial part of their experience as they felt about the clinical part of their experience. And for the people on the other end of the spectrum with no ability to pay, those are the folks that we need to be reaching out to for financial assistance. And making sure those folks can be qualified for those programs in a simple way as possible. What's interesting to see, I think, and of course everyone's grappling with, is that those folks in the middle, or maybe the upper part of the middle, so maybe the 7s and 8s that you mentioned, or even the 6s and some of the 5s, who have ability to pay, but not a $2,000 bill all at once, right? and or they may be more likely just to have questions and confusion about their bill. Maybe they even have an ability to pay $2,000, but they've never had to do that before. And so they have all kinds of questions about that experience and need a way to engage on that to make sure they understand and agree with that bill as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. And I love the way you talked about the propensity to pay capability that a lot of us have as raw material for the kind of analysis that, you know, you're capable of doing. I kind of wish that I had you, Wendy, with me as we were trying to figure out what to do with some of this bad debt exposure over the last several years. So great to see this is starting to become a reality.
Great.
Why don't we move on to the next case study?
All right.
So this is actually a health system that's another client of ours, of VisitPay, I know, that has about a $2 billion annual net patient revenue. And like many of us, chose to outsource to an early out program. It's self-pay. And so as the slide comes up, you'll see, I think, a dilemma that, I mean, most of us as CFOs and directors of patient accounting, VPs of revenue cycle have encountered, which is, at what point do I hold on to the account, and at what point do I assign it to an outside service that will charge a commission to help me collect the bill? So as we go to the next slide, maybe, Wendy, we can talk a little bit about the whole nature of what's happened with early out programs who, you know, maybe have sort of existed for a while, but now there's new information about the accounts themselves that we might want to keep.
Yeah, so I love this example and these examples. I think this is one of the simplest applications of a propensity to pay model or segmentation that can be really powerful for a health system that is using early out, or frankly even has internal operations but that may be less differentiated and they're working accounts early and often already internally, which is, hey, let's identify the people who are, you know, highly likely to pay, and let's not invest time and effort on that, you know, overly so. And so what that means, frankly, in an early out environment is you are not placing these high propensity to pay accounts too early out, or you're at least waiting to see if they get to a later stage. There'll be some fraction of high propensity to pay accounts that don't pay on time. And thereby I'm not, you know, frankly, I'm not paying an early out shop for money that I would have collected anyway. And I'm not risking kind of annoying or creating a bad experience for a person who's going to be a payer as well. So in this specific example on the slide, that's what this health system did. They now keep internally the highest paying accounts, don't place them with early out, you know, statement them, certainly answer questions if there are, you know, inbound calls and questions, but you know, basically then save the contingency fee. And so in this example, you know, this is, you know, well over $1 million per year in growing in terms of avoided contingency fees. And you can imagine, you know, of course, a similar scenario in internal shop if it was just avoiding making the internal investment on operational costs to work accounts earlier as well.
It's great. And Wendy, I'm assuming for a lot of our health systems listening, this is not just about hospital claims. This is about physician claims as well. So the opportunity for the physician group practice to actually do the segmentation before they decide what to send out for early out calls and additional notices to patients really comes in handy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, David. And you know, and interestingly, I think some of these may be most ripe for that in that area too. You know, perhaps on average lower balance account, in addition to being higher propensity to pay, is a great opportunity in this space.
It's great. So let's go moving forward into the next case study. We have a situation here where I think all of us know how challenging it's been to look at your self-pay or your patient pay aging and staring that in the face and really trying to figure out what is it that I want to do to optimize my efficiency. Do I want to hire people to focus on everything, or do I want to differentiate it? And we've got a really significant health system basically looking at this problem in this example. Wendy, tell us a little bit about how the segmentation helped them.
Yeah, so I'd love to spend some time on this here. And so, I mean, this is a challenge everyone faces, especially if they have internal operations. But, you know, external operations may be thinking about these things, is if I am going to invest time, you know, whether that's outbound phone calls with a dialer, or, you know, an agent activated call. And frankly, you can think about this with respect to other things like, you know, sending additional statements or letters or messaging. You know, where should I best invest that time? And, you know, I would say that, you know, having been exposed to the healthcare space for a while now, it seems like the initial focus of that is often balance and kind of stage in the collections cycle, and which makes a heck of a lot of sense, right? But, you know, just using that as an example, there are high balance accounts that may be very low propensity to pay, and frankly, there are lower balance accounts that maybe mid to even high propensity to pay that merit some investment of work effort. So in this slide, which I'll kind of laugh at myself, I realize there's a lot going on in these slides, so I'll ask my audience to forgive me as I kind of step through this. You know, what we're showing on the left is where might you want to spend your work effort, and where are you spending your work effort, and how does that then correlate to also where your patient cash flow from AR is coming from. So if you look at these different segments or segmentations in this example, you know, some of these jump out quite a bit. So if I look at where it says segment 4 or seg 4 on the chart, this is an area where, you know, designing a strategy and having worked with our client and thinking about a strategy where you'd want to spend a fair amount of your effort, right? It's a large source of your cash and potential cash. You know, kind of a mid PTP balance range. That doesn't say that on this slide, but that's kind of what that largely is. And when they assessed where they were spending their time, they were spending a fair amount of their time there, but, you know, not as much maybe as the opportunity warranted. And similarly, when we look at, say, segment 5, you know, here's a place where, you know, you when you think about it through this lens, you probably don't want to spend a lot of your time and effort there, and yet this was consuming, you know, well over, you know, half of their time in their work effort and intensity. And so what this health system did was to go ahead and adjust that strategy and implement strategies differently and reallocate their work effort. And so what we see on the right are some of the outcomes of that. And so what we wanted to sort of be able to compare, you know, seasonality. So you're seeing year-over-year changes in the payment rate, the 90-day payment rate in this example, from those overall having implemented that segment strategy. And what you can see is that after the segmentation go live, there was a, you know, significant improvement in that year-over-year collection rate as they were redirecting work and resources from areas that needed less attention or merited less attention, if you will, to areas where there was more leverage and more value to be gained.
Thanks, Winnie. And I think, you know, this really does illustrate how patients who do have a higher propensity to pay may need more time, and the benefit to our health systems to give them that time. That said, let's move on to the next example, which is right in line. We have a health system that is quite adept with its offline capability in terms of influencing plan duration and how people pick up, you know, the opportunities to maybe take another month or two to pay their bills through a monthly payment, but really want to take advantage of maybe the millennial population who want to do things online and use digital online platforms. Can you talk a little bit about what the data suggests for this particular system that wants to do that?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here. I'll set even more of the stage. So as David said, this is a example from a digital environment, and it's an example of a way to begin differentiating experiences that's effective and also, you know, relatively easy to implement. And so, you know, one of the questions that people have, and I expect we may get some questions about this later, is, what does it mean to really have different offers, meaning different payment plans or different terms, discounts, whatever, different things available to different people. One of the things that can be done, even in the absence of different things available, is just how you guide people through the process. So some people call this concept, in behavior, behavioral psychology, either nudging or anchoring is another term that sometimes folks have used. But we basically say, suggest something to someone. And an interesting thing about the digital environment is you can see the power of this. So what we did, and what this slide is showing, is that while individuals in an online portal had a range of payment terms available to them, so maybe they can get an up to 12, 24, or even 36-month payment plan at varying payment amounts, and they're ultimately in control of that. Put a default out there, right? And so what you see on the left is, part of what you'd see in a UI, that ultimately someone can go in and they can change the payment amount, and that'll give them a different number of payments, so they can put in different number of payments, and that will change their payment amount, and they can find the solution that best meets their situation within the boundaries that the health system has created. But we said, but what if instead of having that blank, you put something in there? And what we found is that absolutely affects behavior. So even with the same set of options ultimately available, in this example, we saw that by suggesting kind of a slightly high or higher perhaps payment amount than the average that people would select, people would choose a higher payment amount and a lower number of payments and a lower payment duration. So here's a nice example where you can kind of help achieve an objective of offering people what they need, and at the same time thinking about the health system and managing what they need as well, by suggesting options that may be more conducive to them personally or more conducive to the health system. Now, if you think about this is, oh, go ahead. Sorry, David.
I was going to say, Wendy, this really gets to the question of moving from our old world where we were pretty much treating everybody the same, and now really giving them a chance to tailor something for themselves that fits their situation better. Could be to pay off a bill faster than they might have considered.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we know just from all industries in a digital world, and just the way people do business, is that's become a consumer expectation. And people's expectations from healthcare are informed not only by healthcare, but by their experiences everywhere else. So what I might think my health provider ought to be able to deliver to me in a consumer or an experience like this isn't just influenced by the other health systems I may have encountered, but it's what was my last experience with Amazon, or with my Bank of America online banking website, or my last shopping experience. And in all of those cases, people understand their patient well, their consumer well analytically, and what that experience looks like to them, how it's presented to them, it is different, and all hinges on most quickly and most efficiently being able to present to the person the option that is most likely to meet their needs. And the players that do that most effectively in other spaces are the ones that are most successful.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think our final example is one of my favorite challenges, which is how do I better manage bad debt? The whole notion that those of us listening into this are looking for proof points or metrics that actually drive performance that could reduce bad debt is of course a major mover, driver for us, Wendy. And I'm curious to know, what you're finding with health systems that are using this data. Do they see a pretty dramatic reduction in bad debt? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think we see people more effectively turning non-payers into payers with a corresponding reduction in bad debt, and that comes from both reducing things that went to bad debt in the first place, And it can come a little bit on the margin, and what this slide speaks to a bit of also being able to understand and work accounts that may have gone to bad debt or be about to go to bad debt. In this specific slide and in this situation, this is a segmentation for accounts that have gone to bad debt, which of course overall have a very low going forward payment rate from that point. And you can see here that even for accounts like that, you can differentiate. And in this specific example, this provider then used that segmentation to focus work efforts on the higher likelihood to pay within bad debt and significantly increase their recoveries or their collections within bad debt. But it's interesting because I think this type of segmentation and analysis always begs the question of how much of that could I catch before this? How can I improve my segmentations or use some of this information even before it goes to bad debt or is placed to bad debt?
Right, exactly. When you're talking to a health system that hasn't done this level of segmentation, can you predict how much of a benefit there is to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And so once you have some analytically and statistically driven models, it's easy to look at an individual health system situation, market demographics, and customer base and what's happening today and how much therefore might you expect to be able to improve that and what is that worth?
Excellent. Well, Scott, it sounds like it's maybe a good time to open up the floor to questions.
Sure. That's fantastic, David and Wendy, and very helpful presentation. Thank you. Let me start with a question for you. There have been a number of examples back that
I'll step in here, David. I think what Scott was asking is, there's been a number of examples that reflect the fact that more payments are coming from consumers than before. So how does this shift change the way you as a CFO measure the performance of the revenue cycle?
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Scott. Abby. So our view about the accounts receivable performance, our number one concern, I think, all along is going to be cash flow. And the reality is that if we do nothing, our cash will actually deteriorate because so many patients now are carrying a patient liability that previously only had insurance coverage. So our view, I think, is that this is really profound for almost every CFO in the country today to start to analyze patient segmentation. Consumer segmentation is not something we grew up learning about, but it's going to become a really important extra toolkit for trying to really keep our cash flow, retain what we have, and potentially enhance it.
Great. Here's a next question, and this is, Wendy, for you. Is it fair to present different financial strategies for different patients, or should we treat everybody the same? How do you look at that issue?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think one we commonly get. I think what we see in industries is solutions being customized to address the needs of people as segments and individuals. And so, I think what's important, a thing that's important in healthcare is that, not-for-profit institutions are fulfilling their mission and providing access to care for people. And at the same time, I think it's really important to be able to help them with their financial health. And that may mean treating people different so that that's a useful, valuable, and sustainable proposition for both the health system and them. What I need to be able to manage my bill may be very different than what someone else needs to manage their bill. And so meeting those individuals where they are, helps people with that experience.
Thank you very much. And David, a follow-up question for yourself. You had mentioned the term liquidation ranges. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of someone who's used to looking at accounts receivable aging, you know, you always wonder, Scott, if you're going to see a liquidation that's going to be as uniform as it looks by age bucket. And I think what Wendy was showing is once you start doing the segmentation, you can start to see that there's different liquidation potential among different components of that aging. So we're used to looking at reports that tell us something about how to action or prioritize follow-up. I think this takes us a step further than just the patient accounting system could, and starts to focus us on where we can put our best efforts, our internal efforts first and foremost on collecting, you know, those balances and liquidating them.
Thank you. A different question about, Wendy, did you have something you wanted to add? Or?
Yeah, you know, what I might add in some of my experience too is that's something that's been, you know, kind of opaque, unintentionally opaque in health care, I think for a while, because systems and processes weren't necessarily designed and set up to think about it that way. You know, I will say with a background in consumer lending, you know, it's how it's thought about all of the time. If I lend out a certain amount of money, how much of that am I going to get back? And you know, we've found, and I think it's still true today that often health systems don't have the structures in place to really know that. They have a good understanding of their receivables and what's going where and what's coming in today. But to be able to say, hey, if for every dollar that a patient owes me, over time on that dollar, how much am I actually getting of that? As folks, hopefully there's some folks chuckling on this to themselves on this webinar of how hard that can sometimes be to answer in existing kind of EMR applications.
Sure, and let me ask a follow-up question, a different question on skim strategy. Does the skim strategy, and maybe you could re-explain it just for a moment, result in your early out vendor charging more to try and make up for it just because you've made their life a little bit more difficult?
Mm-hmm.
Got it. So yeah, the gist of it, what I think you're asking there is, hey, if I suddenly start from the early out vendor's point of view, taking away the easier to work accounts, do they then just charge me more for the remaining accounts? And I think that's a great question. What we've seen is that, you know, health systems have a lot of power and leverage in this situation, especially if they use more than one early out vendor, and that, you know, they've been successful in being able to maintain rates or not have those rates escalate when they're, you know, pressing the early out shops to do more of, you know, where their incremental value add should be. So I think it's an astute question and something to mindfully manage, but I think it's a reasonable demand of an early out vendor to really be spending their time and what they're getting compensated for on where their work efforts add the most incremental value.
Got it. Thank you. And David, here's another question that came in for yourself. Is there an average balance amount that you look at and say, this is a spot where the provider should segment and start making telephone calls? Go ahead.
That's a great question. I think we've talked a lot about where that balance is, and it may vary depending on the health system, Scott, but you know, there's some thinking that at about $500 for many consumers, that starts to be an event worth segmenting because they need to make some resource allocation decisions where they're going to do it. Much above 1,000, 2,000, I think we know the vast majority of patients really do need, no question, some fundamental support in how they're going to handle this. For the patients that are looking at $100 or under, not necessarily that you wouldn't segment that, because we've had some discussions, Wendy, I think, about this. How many patients do we actually segment? Do we wait for them to have a problem, or do we just know 100% of the time what they may need? But Scott, to answer the question about $500, I think so far, Wendy, is what we've been talking about.
Yeah, you know what I'd love to add to that question too. I completely agree with David's answer. When I look at other industries, they would answer that question analytically, right? And there would be a general outcome that could be described in the way that David has answered that question, but it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. You would analytically be able to identify segments and say, hey, what is the value of working that segment? And you could do that through testing and trying different methodologies in the operations as well. And so the answer doesn't necessarily then become one balance cut, which is the dimension we're talking about here, but rather a segmentation that considers both balance and the other factors. And that's one of the things that I think is exciting in this space, is that it's needed and it's conducive to applying that approach.
Great. There's a follow-up question to segmentation, and the question is, by using segmentation, is there a specific percentage improvement in collections that you could attach to that? And approximately, do you have a sense, and it might go to your analytics on this, how much better do you do by using a better amount of segmentation?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. And, I think one of the powerful things in segmentations is that you may be driving both yield, or you may be driving, operational efficiency. And so within a segmentation, if we're talking about operational segmentation, you're going to drive cost savings by avoiding work where you may have placed it in the past. Skim strategy is like that. But to the point, what I think is the spirit of this question, you can also drive higher yield by applying attention or a better experience to those that will now be able to be more willing or able to pay where they didn't before. And so, we shared some case examples here. So I think we've seen 5, 10, even 20% gains in a segment, and the total application of that to the health system may also depend on their situations themselves. But I do think we're talking about very material and quantifiable gains.
Sure. Let me ask you a follow-up question, a little bit different, but similar spirit to tailored plans with patients. You talked about this as a potential differentiator in terms of consumer strategy and how you work with patients. Can you speak a little bit more about that and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think each consumer patient, has their own situation in terms of both willingness and ability to pay, and that can be understood and modeled, analytically, as well as just providing experiences that guide people to the solutions that they need. But in a nutshell, a simple example, I don't want to oversimplify this, but a simple example would be a high propensity, high ability to pay user with a $500 bill. They may just be willing and able to pay that $500 bill. Maybe when it's possible and appropriate, you actually give them a small incentive to do that, right, in the form of a prompt pay discount. Someone who might have a similar bill in a similar situation, $500 or $1,000, that's not something they can pay all at once. And so what you'd love to avoid, if you can, right, is necessarily having the person, with the $500 bill that can pay all at once, now financing that over time, right? But you absolutely want to be able to provide the experience and availability to the person who
and Scott, Wendy, can I add to that point that, I think, and this is early thought leadership for us, I think, but part of the question, I think, would be, as patients oftentimes need multiple serial visits, physical therapy, or during their care delivery, it just takes many, many months for them with a chronic condition. The segmentation would lend itself to trying to understand those patients' needs, because those balances just continue to get created and managed over time. Do we see the opportunity to apply the segmentation to that kind of clinical setting as well?
I mean, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. So, I mean, what you're really talking about in terms of tailored plans is someone could pay all their amount right now, fine. If you could work it out with them to pay it over time, fine. And it's really segmenting and working much closer with your consumers, your patients, et cetera, to work this out. So ultimately, on behalf of the system, you get paid and get paid well, but you do it in a way that's consumer friendly, is what it sounds like, as I hear you.
If you'll allow me to offer as an example something that may seem pedestrian, if we think of consumer finance, we think of credit cards or even different kinds of loans. At one point there was, credit cards. It's hard to imagine now, but there was a credit card, right? And you were approved or declined for it, and there was one annual fee for it, one interest rate for it. Now there are thousands of those combinations. In addition to what the terms are available, there are different affinities and there's different ways of engaging on a portal, right? Not suggesting that's where we want patient financial experience to go, but it can learn from some of that experience and be more differentiated.
Right. It sounds like over a certain amount of money, it's worth really engaging in these strategies. And that's part of how you work on the segments. I've got a number more questions for you. Let me try and move through those just so we keep our audience and keep you guys humming along. There was the model decile show. What does the model decile show? Not clear to me. And David, maybe you could make sense of that, answer that and make sense of the questions, because it's, can you jump in on that?
Yeah, maybe we can flip back to the slide, or if there's something more concrete to refer to for the audience. Wendy, you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think we're pulling up the slide. So I'm assuming the question is directed perhaps to the, well, maybe both sides of the slide, but the left slide is showing actual liquidation rate. So as we talked about a little bit ago, this is portraying for that decile of the model, both an existing model and previous model, what is the percent of each dollar that's owed by a patient in that segmentation or in that decile that is collected, that is paid back in cash. So if you look to the far right, where it says 9, you can see your, probably 90-ish% of every dollar that's owed in that segment is paid. And if you look to the far left where it says 0, practically nothing is collected in that decile. And so that gives you a good profile of payers that then can be parlayed into segmentations and strategies.
Thank you. We've got a number of additional questions that came in, so I'll try and keep on moving through these. Just fantastic. So for one of the examples, and David, you talked about a consumer that selected a high payment for 4 months that was close to the amount that David mentioned where a patient starts to need a payment plan. And I'm not sure if they meant the $500 amount or a different amount. What is the average monthly payment selected when the consumer is empowered with choices? So how much do consumers choose to pay per month when you start to give them choices as to how much they can pay as a minimum or average or maximum payment?
Wendy, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this, like anything, I can answer that question first simply like on an average, right? But I also want to emphasize that there's a lot of differentiation under that, and that's a lot of kind of what we're seeing. So I think you'll typically see people select payment amounts that are in sort of the $150 to $250 range. And I say that in part not only through observation, but I've also seen in consumer finance and other places that for many households, a payment that is much higher than that, say let's call it $250, it becomes much more difficult to pay, and that's just a common thing people can absorb into their budget. So I think that's the short answer to your question. What I would emphasize though is we are talking about averages, and there are many people that want or need, and I think it would be in the health system's interest to offer a lower payment amount. And there are people that will select a higher payment amount, especially, not only if they're able, but there's some, incentive to do that.
No, and that's really helpful to give a real sense of dollar amounts in response to the question. That's really helpful. So 120, 140, 150 is a number that you often see, just simplistically. I've got a couple different questions that can tie off of that in different ways. One is, do patients need a credit application, a FICO score, and so forth if they're financing larger amounts? Or is that not an effort that you guys, how does that fit into this?
Yeah, I can speak to that, and you know, let me just make sure I answer that question in the right way. That can be a general question in the industry, or that can be a question specific to, you know, VisitPay and what we do. Speaking to the industry, the answer is it varies. It depends on the program that different people are using. And also whether, frankly, that the loan, if you will, or the payment plan is being made to the provider, meaning it's still on the provider's balance sheet, or whether someone's lending to the consumer themselves, much just like a loan. In those latter cases, I'm pretty confident they'll always be looking at FICO in addition to other factors. To answer the question for VisitPay, we are able to build sound models and provide differentiating experiences without using FICO or credit score or information from some of those major credit bureaus.
Thank you. Another question. Most of this is geared, it seems, towards mid-sized and larger organizations. Somebody asked the question, if they're a physician practice and they're talking about smaller average amounts, how does this work with that? Does VisitPay work with that? How does that work?
Well, Wendy, I'll start with this one. Yeah, I'll start with this one. I think it's true that we do see, obviously, consolidation of a lot of this revenue cycle activity in the form of health systems. But for physician practices that want to keep pace with this growing trend of consumer debt, I can't think of a more important strategy, because this is actually going to disproportionately impact the physician group, probably first and foremost. So, you know, the concept here is to try to leverage the same technologies for the smaller group practice or the private practice, either through, direct relationship to a vendor like VisitPay or through the health system itself. Because a lot of this is connected to the brand of the health system that a practice might be affiliated with.
Sure. So thank you. A number of other questions, and a couple of great questions that just came in, and they tie together. Do you have better luck with this when the patient is dealt with in terms of payment plans and how to deal with it on the front end, or is this more dealt with on the back end after the patient's gotten their bill? What's your recommendation and best practice, and where do you see the best results?
Yeah, I can speak. I can speak to that, Dave, unless you wanted to first, David.
Well, I'll let you start, Wendy, and then I'll add. Go ahead.
Okay. Excellent.
Sorry about that.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. So I honestly, I think the answer is both. And here's what I mean by that. As we know, there are both challenges and opportunities to collecting and or arranging payment on the front end. And there is also a whole lot of money that ends up on the back end. And so I think there's a real need and an opportunity from both a patient experience perspective and a financial perspective to be able to do both. I think the largest challenge, as we all know, on the front end right now is certainty of balances and balance estimates and whatnot, and those impact both what one would want to implement and also what that experience ends up being like for the patient. So I think there's great value in being able to both collect payment and or arrange payment plans on the front end. And at the same time, it doesn't look likely to replace the need and opportunity to be able to do that after a bill has been received in the near.
Let me ask you a question, a follow-up question to that, Wendy, because I think you hit an exactly great point. Is people are they might want to know there's a payment plan available, but they often don't know what the real balance is going to be on the front end. Is that sort of your experience, that they're sort of waiting to see what their explanation of benefits is and what they really know they owe before they get into doing too clear a payment plan, or do you see a lot of payment plans up front too?
Yeah, I think that can be both consumer and health system driven. So I think that you're describing both the consumer behavior, or you're describing the consumer behavior, which I might not be willing or interested in to do that until I have a clearer view of my balance. And frankly, I feel like I've observed, and hopefully this resonates with folks, that health systems themselves know that there's uncertainty, and they're concerned with either creating a bad experience or creating credit balances or things like that. And so there are ways that one can, and that we at VisitPay have engineered to be able to make these things more self-adjusting and to be able to handle that uncertainty. But that is, I think that's a challenge faced both by consumers and the health system in the current state with respect to front end.
Thank you. David, do you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, only that I think Wendy nailed it as well. I think the question's a great one because it encapsulates the journey that Wendy and I have talked a lot about this offline, that really what we're most interested in as a health system or supporting a health system is the journey that every patient is on from the time they decide, they're going to have an elective procedure or they show up in an emergency department. It's so situational. You don't really know what's going to happen to you. But when you arrive at a health system that's giving you the option of understanding your financial obligations along the journey, that's the best you could ask for. So the idea of doing it front end and making sure people are aware of it, we know we're really good at doing this for charity care and for indigent care. But now we've got a whole patient population of people who really need to know, like most of us, what our obligations might be and how we might address them as we find out whether we have a deductible or a co-insurance amount as we go. So really both front end and back end, I think, are really going to be important for all of us.
Thank you. I want to do this. I want to wrap up by just really thanking Wendy and David. Wendy Alexander, VP of Client Services and Analytics at VisitPay. David, who's been CFO of Boston Children's and also University of Rochester Medical Center. Magnificent panelist. My favorite webinars are like this, where they're highly educational, very informative, really no sales going on, but really engaging and great thoughts on segmentation and how you handle improving and making this more of a consumer-driven, easy to work with for patients and for your systems, and the improvement you've had. So I want to thank VisitPay, magnificent webinar, and I want to thank our audience, almost all of which stayed on all the way through the question and answer. So great panelists. So thank you folks very much. I know VisitPay, you've got a couple of workshops coming up at our CEO Roundtable in November. So we'll look forward to seeing you there and some of your colleagues there that have worked with the VisitPay offerings and talked about them. And David, I know you're on the agenda too. So thank you folks very, very much. We really appreciate it, and I know our audience does too. So thank you folks very much.
Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thanks all.
Thanks, Wendy. Thank you, David. We look forward to visiting with you again shortly. Thank you, folks.
Best of luck. Yes, thanks.
You too.
Have a great day.